True horror stories. Steps into darkness. Abandoned hospital. In the fall of 1998, the trees in rural Pennsylvania turned brilliant reds and yellows. But the air was cold and damp. Michael, a young documentary filmmaker, along with his two best friends, Sarah and David, decided to explore the abandoned Cranbrook Psychiatric Hospital. It had been closed for more than 20 years, and the creepy stories of abused patients and wandering spirits were the stuff of local legend. Michael had always been fascinated by haunted places, and he believed this would be the perfect setting for his next documentary. "There's bound to be some good stories here," Michael said, his voice full of excitement as they drove up the dirt road leading to the hospital. Sarah, who had always been skeptical of the supernatural, frowned and said, "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Michael, I hear this place is dangerous." David, who was passionate about mysteries, was very excited. "Yes, this will definitely be a memorable experience." When the car stopped in front of the hospital gate, a desolate scene appeared before his eyes. The massive building, with broken windows and peeling paint, stood tall in the desolate landscape. The rusty iron gate had partially collapsed, and vines covered the walls. Michael felt a chill run down his spine, even though the weather was not that cold. "Wow, this place is scary," Sarah muttered, her face unable to hide her anxiety. David quickly got out of the car, grabbed the video camera, and started recording. "Great, this angle is perfect," he exclaimed. Michael took out a flashlight from his backpack. "Let's go. Be careful." The three of them walked through the ruined gate together, entering the hospital grounds. Stepping inside the building, a musty, stale, dusty smell hit them. The hallway was long and dark, with peeling walls exposing the red bricks inside. Broken windows made a cold whistling sound. Michael shined his flashlight around the area. Rusted hospital beds were strewn about. Wheelchairs were overturned, and broken glass was scattered across the floor. "It looks like there was a riot in here," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. David, still filming, walked into a room with strange drawings on the walls, distorted shapes, and incomprehensible writing. "Look, this is creepy," he called back, as the three of them explored what seemed to be a treatment room. They heard a strange noise coming from the end of the hallway. "Is someone here?" Michael asked quietly. Listening, the sound repeated, this time clearer, like very soft footsteps moving across the rotten floor. Sarah held Michael's hand tightly, her face full of fear. "We should get out of here," she whispered. David was still curious. "Let me see." He took the flashlight and walked towards the end of the hallway. Michael and Sarah followed him anxiously. As they neared the end of the hallway, the footsteps suddenly stopped. David shined the flashlight on an old wooden door. The door was ajar and seemed to be locked from the inside. Michael tried to push the door, but it wouldn't budge. He peered into the crack, trying to see inside, but saw only pitch black. "Is anyone in there?" he called, but there was no answer. Suddenly, the door shook violently, as if someone was trying to break it down from the inside. A faint moan came from inside, sounding very painful and desperate. Sarah screamed in terror, hugging Michael tightly. David looked a little scared too. Taking a step back, We should go," he said, his voice slurring. Michael felt a strange urge to know what was behind that door. Despite Sarah and David's protests, Michael decided to open the door. He pushed hard with his shoulder against the rotten door, and after a few tries, the door swung open with a loud crack. Before them was a dark, windowless room. The musty, Stench inside was much stronger than outside. When Michael shined his flashlight inside, they saw a simple hospital bed, on which a figure lay still, covered with a white sheet. A cold, creepy feeling enveloped all three of them. Suddenly, the white sheet was slowly pulled down, revealing an old, dirty doll with a strangely painted face and deep black eyes staring straight at them. But what was even more terrifying was that, right behind the doll, on the stained wall, they saw a scrawled line written in blood. "Get out of here, before it's too late." The three of them stood frozen in the doorway of the dark room, the flashlight's shaky light illuminating the gruesome blood on the wall and the eerie doll lying on the hospital bed. A silence fell over the room. Only their gasps could be heard. What is this?" Sarah stammered, her voice choked with fear. She hugged Michael's hand tightly, squeezing it so hard that her knuckles turned white. David, who had been so excited earlier, stood still as a statue, the video camera in his hand trembling slightly. I don't like this at all," he said, his voice lower than usual, his expression unable to hide his unease. Michael, though he also felt a chill run down his spine, tried to keep his composure. Maybe this is just someone's prank," he said, but his voice sounded uncertain. He focused his flashlight more closely on the bloody writing, the letters scrawled in a hurry, full of desperation. "Let's get out of here, before it's too late." The warning made all three of them feel an unspeakable unease. After a tense silence, Michael decided they should explore other areas of the hospital. "We can't stand here forever," he said. "Maybe we'll find some clues elsewhere." Sarah and David reluctantly agreed. Together they walked out of the creepy room, back down the dark hallway. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, the wind whistling through the broken windows making an eerie sound, like the moans of trapped souls. They walked through empty wards, where rusted beds lay abandoned, lockers were overturned, and scraps of paper and old personal effects were strewn across the floor. In one room, they found a yellowed hospital gown, the words Cranbrook Psychiatric Hospital still printed clearly on the front. Sarah shivered at the touch of the gown, the cold, damp feeling of it making her feel sick, as they explored what appeared to be an operating room, with cold metal operating tables and rusty medical instruments scattered about. A sudden loud noise came from the hallway outside. Bang! It sounded like something very heavy had fallen to the floor. All three of them turned around, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What was that?" David stammered, the video camera in his hand shaking. Michael shined his flashlight into the hallway, but saw nothing. The hallway was as dark and quiet as before. "It must be the wind." Michael tried to reassure them, but his voice was still a little shaky. They stood there listening for a while, but no more noise came. However, the feeling that someone or something was with them in this hospital was becoming more and more obvious and terrifying. Michael decided that they should search the administration office, hoping to find medical records or some information about the hospital's history. After a while of searching, they finally found what appeared to be an office, with a large dusty desk, worn leather chairs, and empty bookshelves. On the desk, they found a large, old notebook, the cover faded and the pages yellowed. Michael carefully opened the notebook. The neatly handwritten lines told of the patients who had been treated at this hospital. Stories of suffering, madness, and the cruel treatments that had been applied. Reading these lines, all three of them felt an indescribable sadness and obsession. On one page, they found the name of a patient marked with a red circle, accompanied by a brief note. particularly dangerous patient. As Sarah was looking through some old photos she found in her desk drawer, she suddenly let out a cry of horror. "Michael, David, look at this." She showed them a faded black and white photo of a group of patients standing in front of the hospital. All the patients in the photo had a blank, lifeless look on their faces. But in the back row, there was a tall, thin figure, with his face hidden in the darkness, staring straight into the lens. The scary thing was, they didn't remember seeing anyone with such an appearance in this hospital. All three of them felt a cold chill run down their spines as they looked at the photo. Suddenly, the flashlight in David's hand went out, plunging all three of them into pitch darkness. "David, what's wrong with you?" Michael asked worriedly. I don't know." David stammered. "I think the battery is dead." But Michael was sure that the battery was still full. In the darkness, all three of them felt a cold presence very close to them. They heard a faint wheezing sound, as if someone was standing right behind them. "There's someone here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Michael quickly turned on the spare flashlight, but the weak light was not enough to dispel the darkness. They turned around, trying to see what was behind them, but saw no one. Suddenly, a piercing scream rang out from the end of the hallway. Not Sarah's or David's voice, but a high-pitched female voice, full of pain and despair. The scream echoed in the quiet space, then suddenly stopped. All three of them stood still as statues, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew that they were not alone in this abandoned hospital, and the spirits here seemed to not want them to leave. A piercing scream ripped through the silent night of the abandoned hospital, echoing through the dark hallways before abruptly stopping, leaving a silence more terrifying than ever. The three of them froze, hearts pounding in their chests, breathing raggedly. What just happened?" Sarah stammered, her voice trembling, clinging to Michael's arm as if he were her only lifeline. David, despite trying to appear calm, was pale, the flashlight in his hand shaking slightly, the flickering light adding to the eerie atmosphere of the scene. I don't know," Michael said, his voice unable to hide the panic. "But that wasn't our voice." They looked at each other in the darkness, fear evident in each other's eyes. "We should leave now," Sarah said, her voice pleading. "I can't take it anymore." David nodded in agreement. "I think so. We've gone too far." But Michael was still hesitant, curiosity and the desire to explore still tearing at him. "But we haven't found anything yet. Maybe that scream is a clue?" After a brief argument, Michael finally convinced Sarah and David to continue exploring. They decided to go to the end of the hallway, where the scream came from. They moved cautiously, stepping lightly on the rotten floor, trying not to make any noise. The hallway was dark and cold. The smell of mold and stench was getting stronger. Michael's weak flashlight wavered, just enough to illuminate a small area ahead. They passed through empty hospital rooms, where rusty beds lay still like coffins. In some rooms, they saw strange drawings on the walls, distorted, pained faces and meaningless words written in something dark red, probably blood. The deeper they went inside, the heavier and more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if there was an invisible presence watching their every step. As they neared the end of the hallway, they came to a large wooden door, different from the hospital room doors they had passed. This one seemed more solid, and the old wood had strange drawings carved into it, symbols that Michael, Sarah, and David had never seen before. There was a rusted metal plate above the door, but they couldn't read what it said. "This must be some important room," Michael said, his voice low with curiosity and a little fear. He tried the door, but it wouldn't open. He looked closer and saw a large rusted lock holding it shut. "It's locked," he said. David tried pushing on the door with his shoulder, but it wouldn't budge. "There must be something important inside," David said, his face determined. Michael pulled out a small crowbar from his backpack, which he had brought with him. He carefully pried open the rusty lock on the door. After a few minutes of struggling, the lock finally came free, making a dry, click sound that echoed in the quiet hallway. Michael slowly pushed the door open. Inside was a large, dark room. The musty and stale smell that assaulted their noses was even stronger than outside. Michael shined his flashlight inside, and they saw a horrifying scene. The room seemed to be an old operating room, with a large metal operating table in the middle of the room, surrounded by rusty medical instruments and bottles filled with opaque yellow liquids. But what terrified them most was that on the operating table, they saw a figure lying motionless, covered in a white cloth covered in dried blood. The three of them stood frozen in the doorway, no one daring to step inside. A silence fell over the room, only their heavy breathing and the soft whistling of the wind outside the broken window. We should call the police," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. David nodded in agreement, his face pale, but Michael remained still, his eyes fixed on the figure lying on the operating table. He felt a strange urge, a need to know who it was. He slowly walked into the room, his two friends following anxiously behind him. As they approached the operating table, Michael reached out with a trembling hand and pulled down the white sheet. The face revealed made all three of them scream in horror. It was the face of a young woman, but her eyes were wide open, her mouth gaping as if she were screaming in pain, and there was a deep cut on her neck. The blood had dried into terrifying black streaks. Just as Michael pulled down the sheet, the door to the operating room suddenly slammed shut. A loud bang that startled all three of them. They rushed back, trying to open the door, but it was locked from the outside. "No, it can't be," Sarah screamed, pounding on the door. Michael tried to pry the door open with a crowbar, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped in this terrifying operating room, with the young woman's corpse and a terrifying feeling that they were not alone. Suddenly, they heard heavy footsteps coming towards the operating room from outside the hallway. The footsteps were getting closer, getting clearer, and they knew that whoever or whatever was coming, it was definitely not their friend. The heavy footsteps grew closer, echoing in the silent hallway like a countdown to doom. Michael, Sarah, and David stood frozen in the operating room, their breathing ragged, mixed with the pounding of their hearts that seemed to be about to burst from their chests. What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice choked with fear, tears already streaming down her pale face. David, though still holding the flashlight, its light wavered wildly, reflecting his utter panic. I don't know," he stammered. "The door's locked. We can't get out." Michael looked around the room, trying to find another way out. The broken windows high above seemed like the only hope, but they were too small and too high. "We have to hide," he said urgently. "Find a place to hide." The three of them hurriedly sought cover behind the rusty medical cabinets and the cold operating table, trying to hold their breath and pray that the worst would not happen. The footsteps stopped right outside the operating room door. An eerie silence filled the room. Only the panting of the three people hiding could be heard. Then, a dry click sounded, as if someone had just inserted a key into the lock. The door slowly opened, the rusty hinges ringing in the quiet space. making the tense atmosphere even more stifling. A tall, dark shadow fell onto the floor, and a blurry figure appeared in the doorway. David's weak flashlight shakily shone on the figure, but it was not enough for them to see his face clearly. They saw only a tall, thin figure, standing still as a statue, enveloped in a cold and deadly aura. The figure stood still for a moment, then slowly walked into the room. Each step he took made a heavy clack, clack sound on the cold floor. As he moved closer, Michael, Sarah, and David could see more clearly. It was a tall man, wearing an old and dirty doctor's coat, his face pale and haggard, his deep-set eyes staring at them with a look of cruelty and hatred. He held a shiny scalpel in his hand, the long, sharp blade reflecting the weak flashlight. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice hoarse and cold as ice. "This is my place." He glanced at the corpse on the operating table, then turned back to Michael, Sarah, and David with a creepy smile. "You will join her soon." With no other choice, Michael decided to act. He rushed out of his hiding place, shoving the ghostly doctor, trying to knock him off balance. The doctor staggered back a step, but still held the knife tightly in his hand. Sarah and David quickly rushed out, trying to help Michael. A terrifying struggle took place in the cramped operating room. The doctor was unusually strong, swinging the knife wildly, forcing Michael and his two friends to dodge. In the chaos, Sarah accidentally bumped into a shelf containing medical instruments, causing it to fall down with a loud bang. Glass bottles shattered on the floor, scattering sharp shards. The loud noise seemed to have attracted the attention of other forces in the hospital. While Michael and David were trying to restrain the doctor, Sarah heard a cold whisper right next to her ear. "You're next." She turned around in shock, but saw no one. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder, squeezing so tightly that she couldn't move. Sarah screamed in horror, trying to struggle, but the hand held her still. She looked toward Michael and David, but they were too busy struggling with the doctor to notice her. Sarah felt as if someone was pulling her toward the darkness at the end of the room. She tried to hold on to a nearby cabinet, but her fingers were losing strength. She saw a blurry figure of a woman, wearing a long white dress, standing at the end of the room, her face pale, her deep black eyes looking at her with sadness and resentment. The struggle between Michael, David, and the ghostly doctor continued to be intense. Suddenly, the door to the operating room was opened, not by someone, but as if some invisible force had acted on it. A cold wind blew into the room, carrying a musty and fishy smell that was stronger than ever. The doctor stopped, turned his head to look at the door, his eyes filled with horror. "No, it can't be," he muttered. Immediately after, a large, shapeless black shadow appeared in the doorway, so tall that it almost touched the ceiling. The black shadow slowly entered the room, and the ghostly doctor seemed to be frozen in place. Unable to move, the black shadow approached him, and for a moment, Michael, Sarah, and David saw clearly. The black shadow slowly devouring the doctor. A scream of horror rang out, then silence. The shadow turned to look at Michael, Sarah, and David, and a cold, echoing voice rang out in their heads. "You will be like him." The giant shadow stood in the doorway, so tall that it almost touched the mottled ceiling. Michael, Sarah, and David stood still like statues, frozen in utter horror. They couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. The scene of the ghostly doctor being swallowed by the shadow still haunted their minds. What is it?" David stuttered, his voice choked. his eyes wide with horror. Staring at the shadow slowly entering the room, Sarah hugged Michael tightly, her body shaking violently, sobs escaping from her throat. Michael also felt a paralyzing fear. He had never experienced anything so terrifying. That shadow was unlike anything he had ever seen or heard of. It exuded an evil, bone-chilling energy. The shadow moved slowly, gracefully, like a thick black smoke creeping across the floor. There were no footsteps, but its presence made the air in the room feel stuffy and heavy. As it drew closer, Michael could feel a cold gust of air blowing against his face, carrying a strange scent, both sweet and rotten, like the smell of wilted flowers mixed with the smell of corpses. The shadow stopped right in front of them, so tall that they had to look up. There was no face, no eyes, no recognizable features, just a mass of black, shapeless, but terrifying. "You woke me up," a voice echoed in their heads. Not a sound coming from their mouths, but a whisper, cold and powerful. "Now you will pay." Michael tried to regain his composure. He knew that they could not just stand here and wait to die. "We have to run," he shouted, pulling Sarah and David's hands. They turned back, rushing towards the locked door. Michael tried his best to open the door, but it was still there. He punched the door hard, then rammed it with his shoulder. But to no avail. The door seemed to be locked, with something stronger than a lock. The shadow slowly turned around. It was in no hurry. It seemed to know that they could not escape. One of the medical instruments on the operating table suddenly flew into the air, then fell to the floor with a loud crack. Sarah screamed in horror. She covered her face and sobbed, while Michael and David were trying to find a way to open the door. Sarah suddenly felt someone touch her shoulder. She turned around in surprise, and saw the figure of the woman in white that she had seen before standing right behind her. Her face was still pale and lifeless, but her deep black eyes looked at Sarah with a sad expression, as if she was begging for something. She shook her head slightly, then pointed to a dark corridor on the opposite side of the room. Sarah looked in the direction she was pointing, and she realized that it was a passageway that they had never noticed before. "Michael, David, there's another way here," she shouted, pointing to the dark corridor. Michael and David quickly turned around when they heard Sarah's voice. They saw a small door on the opposite side of the operating room. It was dark and seemed to lead to an area deeper inside the hospital. The figure also turned its head. It seemed to have realized their intention to escape. It let out an angry growl, and the surgical lights hanging from the ceiling began to shake violently. Then suddenly fell, shattering on the floor. Shards of glass flew everywhere, almost hitting Michael and his two friends. "Hurry, we don't have time," Michael shouted, pushing Sarah and David towards the small door. They hurriedly went through the door, leaving the angry roaring shadow behind. The hallway behind the small door was darker and colder than the rest of the hospital. They walked down the hallway, Michael's weak flashlight the only source of light. They heard the heavy footsteps of the shadow still chasing after them. "It's still chasing us," David gasped. Suddenly, they saw a large door at the end of the hallway, which seemed to be the exit from the hospital. A glimmer of hope flashed in their hearts. They ran towards the door at full speed, but as they got closer, they realized that the door was locked with a large chain and a large lock. They were trapped. The shadow slowly appeared at the end of the hallway, standing there, blocking their only exit. Its cold voice echoed in their heads once more. "No one can escape from this place." Michael, Sarah, and David stood there, frozen, despair covering them like a black curtain. The shadow still stood there, at the end of the hallway, unmoving, but its presence was enough to chill them to the bone. "No, it can't be, we're trapped," Sarah sobbed, her head falling onto Michael's shoulder, hot tears soaking through his shirt. David pounded on the chained door, the loud bang echoing in the silent hallway. But the chain remained. "There has to be a way. There has to be a way out of here," he shouted, his voice filled with anger and fear. Michael tried to keep his composure, looking around the dark hallway, searching for any sign of another way out. His weak flashlight beamed across the patchy walls, the closed hospital doors, but there was nothing but darkness and desolation. Suddenly, Sarah lifted her head, her eyes widening as if she had just remembered something. "Michael, I remember. When we were in the administration office, I saw an old map of the hospital. There seems to be an emergency exit at the back of this area." Michael and David looked at each other, a glimmer of hope flashing in their eyes. "Do you remember where it is?" Michael asked, his voice filled with anticipation. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to recall every detail on the old map. It seems to be at the end of this hallway. On the left, there's a small door hidden by a large filing cabinet." There was no time to hesitate. The three of them ran towards the end of the hallway, where Sarah remembered the emergency exit. The shadow seemed to have realized their intentions. It started moving faster, thick black smoke crawling across the floor, chasing them. When they reached the end of the hallway, they saw a large, old filing cabinet leaning against the wall. Michael and David quickly pushed the cabinet, which slowly moved, revealing a small, narrow door that was also old and dusty. The door was not locked, and Michael hurriedly opened it. Inside was a narrow, dark staircase leading down to a deep, dark basement. "Let's go. Hurry," Michael shouted. He was the first to enter the dark staircase. Sarah and David anxiously followed. As they had just walked down a few steps, a dark figure appeared at the end of the hallway, growling angrily, trying to rush towards them. But the door to the staircase was too narrow. It could not get through it. The dark figure raised its hand, and the walls around them began to shake violently. Groans and wails echoed throughout the basement. They knew they didn't have much time left. They ran down the dark stairs, each step making terrifying noises. The air in the basement was cold and damp. The musty and stale smell was even stronger than on the upper floors. They walked through the tangled corridors, the small rooms filled with old, rusty objects. Suddenly, they heard footsteps chasing behind them. Not the heavy footsteps of a dark shadow, but light, gliding footsteps. They turned around and saw the silhouette of a woman in white hovering behind them. Her face still expressionless, but her eyes looking at them with a pleading look. She raised her hand, pointing to a wooden door at the end of the corridor. Michael, Sarah, and David ran as fast as they could toward the door the woman had pointed to. They opened it, and saw the faint light of dawn filtering through a small window. They had reached what appeared to be the old morgue of the hospital. The room was cold, with long stone tables and rusted drawers for corpses. But more importantly, they found another door at the end of the room, this one leading outside. They rushed toward the door, opened it, and stepped outside, breathing in the fresh morning air. They had escaped Cranbrook Asylum. When they looked back, the abandoned building still stood in the morning mist, silent and ominous as a reminder of the horrors they had just experienced. They knew that the memories of that night would haunt them forever, and they would never dare return to that place. But they had survived, and that was the most important thing. Thank you for listening to today's story. If you want to challenge your nerves further, subscribe to the channel to continue discovering other horror mysteries.